Well, here we are. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. And this is at least the fifth take I've done trying to get this intro down. I wanted to come in with big energy. I had this idea to just come in and say, hey, fancy meeting you here. Come on in, and try to have some big inviting energy. But it just felt wrong, didn't feel right. And I thought, why, what's going on? And then it hit me. Oh, right. We've been watching videos of black men getting executed in the street in broad daylight, and Minnesota's burning. Oh, right. The country's falling apart. And you know what's really haunting to me? And if you've been around, you might remember this. I have a very specific memory of saying on this show, how bad does it have to get before we start to go to the streets and throw rocks in windows? I remember saying that when we were talking about the elections and stuff, and maybe we've gotten there. Maybe we've gotten to that point. And it's not just easy to say, hey, people shouldn't be burning stuff. No, it's not that easy to say that. And people want to talk about looting. What about all the looting that happened on Wall Street? Way worse looting happening there. It is really stark and frightening imagery. And then I won't, it's sort of apropos for today's talk, but I won't deny some part of me is like, I don't even trust the stories and the images. I don't trust mainstream media anymore. That's part of their topic today. It's really so hard to feel like we're getting the truth. And my wife and children, they've been away. They went to my in-laws maybe 4 or 5 days ago, so I've been in solitude. I've really had some new time to think on things. And I was mentioning, I think last week, that I've really been avoiding having direct conversations about the pandemic and, getting too into stuff that was too raw. Everything is so raw and scary right now, and I just didn't feel like I was in a place where I had an informed place to speak from on any of it. So I've been, as I said, comforting myself with certain kinds of conversations, but I really felt like now it's been over 3 months, and the initial fear of getting it has worn off. Not that there isn't still fear there, but I've lived with it for this long. And, Pennsylvania's starting to reopen slowly, this week. And I've just been really reflecting on what this whole thing says about what I teach. And I'm exploring it in my blog post this month, which is already up. You can go read it. It's called, Is Trusting My Intuition Delusional? And I'm really looking at things that I've taught in the context of this pandemic and trying to make sure that I'm not part of the problem of people not taking this seriously or pacifying people and blinding them to things that we need to be paying attention to. I don't want to be contributing to, like I said some weeks back, the neoliberal snow job that keeps us all acquiescent. In any case, I encourage you to read the blog, Is Trusting My Intuition Delusional? And today's conversation with Beres starts to touch on it as well. I actually had this conversation with Derek while I was in the middle of writing the blog. And so I was sort of testing some of the ideas with him. We also go to a number of other places. And I'll just say, I'm not going to tell you who's coming on, but the next few weeks, is where I decided to get into it. Because right now it's like this pivotal point where we're really faced with what we're looking at now going forward. What does this reopen look like? And some of the choices that we're all individually facing that we have to make. So I decided I wanted to have some conversations about that. As scary as it is to tackle those conversations, as risky as it is, I felt like the time had come. So we will start today with Derek Beres. And Derek and I go way back. I mean, we don't really know each other at all, but we certainly have been in each other's radars for a decade at least, and we have a lot of mutual friends. And I've thought to have him on the show many times, but this really was the perfect moment, I think. Derek recently wrote an article debunking that video that went viral. Maybe some of you saw it, called Plandemic. And I'll admit, and I admit it when I talk with Derek, that I got sucked in a little bit, not fully, but some friends of mine got definitely sucked into that movie, and there was things wrong with it, for sure. There was definitely some conspiracy shit kind of hidden in there. And so Derek's article was the thing that made me think, oh, wait a second, I should check closer. And when I did, I thought, oh no, this is actually a problem. And so I reached out to Derek and we spoke about that. And like I said, a whole bunch of other stuff, including his new book that's coming out soon on psychedelics and plant medicine. Also, Derek does not mind getting into politics. So we actually did a little politics. We didn't get crazy, but, you know, like I said, this is just the start of getting into some things. And I really enjoyed connecting with Derek on some of this stuff. And I'm excited that you're going to get to hear it today. Before we do, let me say something to any of you who are yoga studio owners or managers who are trying to figure out what to do. Hopefully your space is still okay, and maybe your landlord's working with you, or maybe it wasn't so high and you feel like maybe you're going to be able to get through this, and now you're looking at starting up again. Well, I don't know what software you were using to manage your studio. I know there's the one that everybody uses. Well, maybe you want to explore looking at something else. And today's sponsor, KarmaSoft, is, I think, a better alternative to what else is out there. I used KarmaSoft when I had my yoga center in Brooklyn. Longtime listeners have heard me talk about it many times. The owner, Rudy Senegal, he's been on the show. Go back and listen to the episode. Listen to him talk about the company and why he runs it the way that he does. And even just last week, a listener of this show reached out to me. He was like, I'm trying to get in touch with Rudy, and I got them in touch, and hopefully that worked out. I don't know if it did, but hopefully it worked out. I know Rudy's really out there coming up with solutions for people to get them through. So, something for you to consider right now as you're looking to remake your future. Check out KarmaSoft. Go to karmasoftonline.com. Also, this episode is brought to you in support from podcast premium subscribers Adriana Lima and Teresa O'Malley. We are so grateful to people like Adriana and Teresa who've chosen to become podcast premium subscribers. Not only does this give you full access to the archives, but it is also the best way to help support this show. So we're just always grateful to anyone who makes that gesture. Thank you, Adriana and Teresa. If you want to find out about becoming a podcast premium subscriber, or read the blog that I was mentioning before, or find any of my stuff, go to jbrownyoga.com. Okay, I think that's fine. I will touch base with you on the other side about a few things, but let's go ahead and get to this. Let's listen to this conversation that I had with Derek Beres.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me on. I look forward to talking to you again.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. And as I said in the email, it's long overdue. And I feel like it's sort of a shame these days whenever I go to start one of these conversations that I feel like I can't just jump into stuff that I first have to ask how folks are doing with everything that's going on in the pandemic. But I feel like I have to ask that before we get into anything because we're all still so in the midst of it. And I know I'm here in Pennsylvania and they're already, moving parts of the state from red to yellow or whatever and talking about reopening. I think you're in Los Angeles, right?
Yes, correct.
So I'm curious, I think they're being a little more strict. What do things look like on the ground where you are?
The city and the state is really leading in terms of effort. We were the first state to lock down, and Los Angeles is the first city to offer testing for every citizen, regardless if you're showing symptoms or not. So on a governmental level, I think they're handling it very well. I think most people are handling it well, but I keep getting reports from people who live by the beach that there's just constantly masses at the beach of people. And there's been some protests in Huntington Beach. There's been some protests in Northern California. So you're seeing small pockets of people who don't understand what sacrifice means on any level. So there's that problem. It's Memorial Day weekend this weekend, so I'm sure there'll be an influx. I've been doing a lot of bike riding, besides building a gym in my friend's garage. That's the only person I've been in contact with besides my wife is my training partner. And so we also bike ride a few days a week, and we go all over the city. And there's definitely been an uptick in traffic in the last 2 weeks. So there's more activity, and there's more there is a lot of apprehension from most people, but there's still some people who are just like, I'll be fine, and they're just doing whatever. And it's going to play out how it plays out.
It is. And I'm curious, when you go for your bike rides, do you wear a mask?
I do not when I'm bike riding. When I'm walking around, I do.
Well, I just had a conversation last night with a bunch of yoga teachers that I do this weekly call with. And that was kind of the conversation where some states are starting to open up again. And they have the new, even when you get to the whatever green or stage, they're still going to be using distancing and masks when you're inside with people. And so it's kind of this question, how have we thought about it, and how do we feel about teaching in a mask? And is that an issue at all? I mean, they certainly do that in other cultures. Like I've spent time in Japan. It's not unusual in other cultures to wear masks. But I guess I'm just sort of curious how other yoga teachers are thinking about that. Like, do you have any issues teaching in a mask? Does it mean anything to you to wear one or to not wear one?
I will wear one if that's what Equinox rolls out as the protocol. I'm okay with that. I know that it will be challenging. I think that the idea of a gym opening right now is still just... I've seen 24-hour fitness's protocols and I've seen Equinox's protocols, and they're in a very tough situation. But I think that trying to charge members the same prices for the experiences that they'll get with the new protocols is not going to work. In terms of teaching, I think that the worst place to be is in a closed room with a bunch of people sweating and breathing. And I think especially with yoga, especially with cycling, because it's much more cardiovascular than yoga, or my main studio, I teach kettlebell classes, for example. It's going to be very hard for people to work out at that level in a mask. I have put it on when I bike ride. I mostly don't, but I've tried it. And even that level of cardiovascular activity, it's hard. So I don't see in a closed room setting that people will be able to tolerate that. We'll see. And again, if that's what is asked of me to get back in room and people are down with that, I'm okay with wearing a mask. But I think it's going to be very hard.
So interesting. And then I guess there'll be spacing and masks probably.
We did spacing for a week before we shut down. I mean, we were trying that. We limited classes to half capacity and everyone stayed a little bit farther apart. But again, if you're in a 200, 300 square foot room with even 10 other people, if one person has it and it gets out, everyone in that room is going to inhale it. Unless, the mask obviously, but you take it off for a moment, it's a little bit loose. There's just... There was an article this morning I shared with my wife. I haven't read all of it, but it's about a cook who is saying that the restaurant industry needs to die. It needs to be rethought because it wasn't working. And I know this because my wife's in hospitality, how hard of an industry that is on most workers. And I think you're going to see something similar in fitness. It's just the model is not going to work for a little while at least. And so who is going to make it? Who's going to come out on the other side? Independent studios, it's going to be very hard. But even, Gold's Gym went bankrupt. 24-Hour Fitness has been battling bankruptcy before this, and right now they're not in a good position. So it's, how can you last a year and a half like that? So I think we're going to be rethinking how we approach fitness. And it's just indicative that I've been teaching online for 8 years, and I know you've taught online for a long time as well. But because of the situation, my living room is now my wife's dance studio and my yoga studio. And I have 32 classes archived now, and it's donation based, but it's going really well. And so I really miss teaching publicly, and I miss interacting with people, but I am getting feedback from both my students and then people I don't even know who found me. And it's really helping them through this time. So I'm just going to keep doing that and be safe until we figure out what the next iteration is.
I think that a lot of us are in the same boat as you there. It's interesting to hear you talk about the fitness studio models, because we certainly think the same is true for yoga studios. And we've been talking about the sustainability of the yoga studio model for a while on the show. And I guess that's interesting to me, because that's something that I had an idea about you, and maybe it's a little bit true. And I mentioned in my email to you, I was like, oh, I don't know why you've been so long. You haven't been on the show. And I think one of the reasons is I had it in mind, and maybe it's not true, although I saw on your bio, it said this, that you did at some point kind of move in a more fitness direction. Am I right? Like, it doesn't say yoga teacher in your bio, it says fitness instructor. So I'm curious, I don't mean to pigeonhole you. I know you teach yoga, but in my mind, at some point, you did sort of move. I don't know. You used to live in New York, right?
Oh yeah, I grew up in New Jersey.
Right. So did you start in a more fitness place or a more yoga place, or am I not remembering it right?
I grew up an athlete. I played every sport possible. I played 10 seasons of baseball, and then I grew a lot. I played basketball, I played volleyball, I played football, I played golf. I still play golf, played tennis. So movement, it's always, my life has been movement. And the evolution of that was when I was in college, I experimented. I tried out Tai Chi, tried a little yoga, but martial arts kind of caught me for a while. So I was doing Taekwondo, and then after college, I was playing with capoeira. And then I was dating someone who started introducing me to dance, to a modern dance class called Alan Wainwork.
Is that where you met Brendan?
That's how I know Brendan. Yes, Brendan was my teacher.
We got to give a shout out to Brendan McCall, because I knew him back when I was in that world a little, and he's a mutual friend of ours. So that makes sense. That's where you met him, when you were doing Alexander work with him.
Alan Wayne work
Alan
at the
Wayne,
time.
that's right. Not Alexander. Alan Wayne, which is different.
It's Alan Wayne was a classically trained ballet dancer who went to India and came back to revolutionize the ballet world through his understanding of modern dance in India and yoga, which he found in India. And when he came back, he never revolutionized ballet, but what he did do was create a community predominantly for actors and artists in New York, because there's something about the movement, and there's almost like sort of a Kundalini vibe to it, in the sense that you'll do repetitive motions for like 15 or 20 minutes as part of the warm-up. And by the time you get your body so juiced, you just start vocalizing, and that just comes out. So a lot of singers and actors really took to it. And Brendan is one of like 3 or 4 teachers in the world. It never really caught. It had a moment, I believe, in the 70s. And this is all from Brendan, my understanding of it. So I might, if I messed anything up, I'm sorry. But that first hour of ballet and yoga warming up, that led to the second hour of the class, which was modern dance, where it was more situational than choreographed. It changed my entire understanding of my body and movement in general. And so Brendan also became my first yoga instructor. And at that time, he had just been dating a woman named Sadie Nardini. And I became friends with Sadie and Brendan, and they brought me into the movement salon where I started my yoga practice. And then that was the first place I started teaching at years later. I did yoga for about 5 years before I started teaching. And I think like anything, I just really took to yoga, and that became such a dominant force of my life. But I was always doing other workouts. But in the last few years, I really understood as I was getting older that I wasn't doing enough cardiovascular activity and I wasn't loading my body. So I got much more back into fitness, which I had left in college. And I started lifting weights a lot more and bike riding and things like that. And then being at Equinox, what's so great about that environment is there's world-class teachers of every discipline there. So I was always just taking any class I could. And so that just translated into my teaching. And I realized that just calling myself a yoga instructor doesn't really fit into what I do. And to me, everything is fitness. So whether you're talking mental fitness, emotional fitness, physical fitness, being fit in every aspect of your life is really my goal, and optimizing all of those because they work together. So that's why I changed the verbiage from just yoga to fitness, but yoga is still predominantly what I teach.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. And it also is interesting to me because you didn't, it wasn't what I thought. It wasn't like you started going to Jiva Mukti or something like I did and were kind of like in the yoga world and then branched out. You were always branched out. And that kind of lens, the other thing that I remember about you, and this goes back to the early blogosphere days, and I mentioned you that I just recorded a talk with Neil Pollack, I'm not sure if it'll post before or after this, but in any case, we were talking about those early blogosphere days. And I have this very specific memory of you really defending Equinox because people were like, Jim, yoga's bullshit. And you were like, no, it's not actually, and I just remember you like laying it down how Equinox was like a good gig. And the fact that you've been with them for so many years and yoga teachers struggle, to have a gig. And it just seemed to me like you had a perspective early on where you really had a pretty wide open lens. Like, in fact, honestly, I'll give you a little credit. It was you, I think, like a post that you made that was the first person who ever turned me on to someone like Ido Portal. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. I remember you being like, this guy's amazing. And I was like, oh, that is really interesting. But I remember you as somebody who was really who's looking at this new evolution of yoga that I've been talking about on this show where the gurus have fallen and now everybody's into proprioception or whatever. It seemed like you were kind of there earlier on than I was.
I was even talking yesterday. I was talking with Matthew Remsky and Jillian Walker on my podcast, and it turns out we're actually going to start our own podcast, branching out starting next week, because we have a very good flow going about the topics we're discussing, which you and I discussed briefly on email.
Yeah,
and
we'll get there.
And I had mentioned in 1995 I was a religion columnist, and that's the other thing is I've been in journalism longer than teaching yoga.
Yeah, I heard that when you guys were talking and you took, we'll get to your article about pandemic and how you took shit for being a yoga teacher. And I was like, I remember you being a journalist before I remember you being a yoga teacher, actually. Maybe those are happening at the same time, but I remember you putting yourself out there as a writer earlier on.
Right. And in 1993, my freshman year of college, I started working for the school newspaper. So it's been, I have never stopped writing for publication since then. I started teaching yoga in 2004. So there was a long period of full-time journalism after college before I got into movement. And part of that was because at the time, I was an editor of a world music magazine, and I was mostly working in music journalism. And I was like, this industry is not going to last. Like, making a living as a music writer is extremely difficult. And I noticed that, and I realized that I could at least supplement my income through teaching. And that's how that transition happened. But in 95, I was the religion writer for the Daily Targum at Rutgers, which was the school newspaper. And they assigned me to go see Sri Ravi Shankar do an event. And this was in the suburbs of New Jersey. I think it was in Edison, because there's a large Indian community in Edison. And I remember going, and even being 20 years old at the time, I very much enjoyed the breathing exercises that he did, which is just basic pranayama. But as a 20-year-old kid who had no relationship to that, it was brand new. So just taking a half an hour to slow down your breath and do Nadi Shodhana was an eye opener for me. So my nervous system, put me in this state. But then afterwards, everyone lined up to touch his feet. And even at that point, I looked around and I didn't get in line because I was like, this is strange. Like, why would I do that? And now I know that there is this history of that, but to be honest, I still think it's strange. I think it's the whole guru mentality has been outdated, and it was something that never really gelled with me. So even in the first yoga class I took in New York was in 1998, which was at Jivamukti when it was at Lafayette, and I did some work for Jivamukti. I did graphic design work for them, and I did a remix for Sharon, and so I was in that community. I knew it, and I was around it. But anytime I went to events and they were just fawning, I just didn't get it. I didn't understand it. I'm like, I respect them. David is an exceptional teacher. I really like his workshops. But when it gets into that, when it breaches that line of just like, there's something you can appreciate a good teacher, but when you think that teacher knows everything or has a certain way that encompasses reality, that's always been problematic to me.
Right. You've always been the skeptic, and I've always appreciated that, and it bears relevance, to the other things that I reached out to you about, because with everything that's been going on, it seems like, with the invent of social media and the kind of sensationalization that goes on there and the kind of, fake news thing that's emerged over the years, it seems like it feels like it's harder to get accurate or authoritative information. And I know that, you wrote this piece about Plandemic, which I really appreciated. And I want to be really honest with listeners and just with you and everybody that I did watch Plandemic, and I didn't buy it all the way. Like, I didn't buy it hook, line, and sinker. And I didn't post it out to anybody, although I did send it to one friend email wise. I think I'm someone who has in my life tended towards conspiratorial thinking. And I think, to this day, I'll just admit this out loud, and maybe it's going to get me in trouble. I've never heard anybody explain, well, World Trade Center 7 fell even though no planes hit it, or whatever. I'm someone who goes there, and I know that about myself. And right now, in the midst of all this pandemic, I've been very careful, trying to really make sure I know where the information I'm looking at, where it's coming from. But I've seen contradictory information from reputable sources on both sides in this situation. So it is really hard to know. And it seems like you're somebody who you do really you're like an evidence-based person. And you really did, I think, an effective job of addressing the Plandemic video. I also heard you talk about how, and we'll get to this later, you're doing research into, the healthcare industry in general. And there are times where the profit motive in the healthcare industry is actually not serving people well. So there are kind of some conspiracies, just not the ones that were in that video.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so when did you first see this Plandemic movie, and why did you take it upon yourself to try to speak to it?
I saw it very quickly. It would talk about a juggernaut on social media. So the day it came out, I saw it, and I immediately, what raised my eyebrows initially was that in the description, Mickey had written the very first line, "This will get taken down." And in my head, I'm like, okay, if that's your warning shot, then I'm going to be questioning what's in it. Because if you're presenting something truthful, you don't need that disclaimer. And it turns out that he used copyrighted material in that. And there was also false claims, like the idea that wearing a mask makes you sicker. And that's why it got taken down. But the fact that he led with it, and the fact that he, and I referenced this in the article, used Godwin's law, which is in the second paragraph, he's relating vaccines to Hitler. Right there, you have these warning signs right away, even before you get to the content, that there's going to be a problem with the content. And we've mentioned the blogosphere. In 2012, I started a blog called Yoga Brains with 4 other teachers here, including Julian Walker in Los Angeles, because we all are politically and socially minded. And it's always bothered me, especially given the history of yoga. It's intertwined with politics. Like the Buddha was a master politician, right? After he studied yoga with 2 teachers, when he was creating his Sangha, he had to deal with local lords to be able to allow him to build his communities there. There was politics in yoga forever. So this idea that yoga shouldn't be political is really a misnomer, and it only could happen in a culture that's privileged like America. And that's what happened. It got brought up in this weird system starting, especially in the 80s. I mean, it kind of started with Theos Bernard in the 40s, but that's a whole other trail. But so I've been addressing these topics for a long time in my thinking and in my writing. And what I feel like what happened at this moment is that a lot of people, and I keep putting quotes around this term because it deserves it, but the wellness community, for lack of a better word, people who really do care about their body and their environment and the food they put in their body and questioning the drugs and why, all those are very valid points that should be considered. Our food system's atrocious. Our healthcare system's atrocious. Those are true things. But these are people, and especially in Los Angeles and this surrounding area, that have always been checked out of politics. And so now all of a sudden you're in a situation where they have to stay at home. You're going to spend more time online and on social media because what else are you doing at this time? And you see the flashiest bright lights come at you. And so you have all of a sudden people thinking that Judy Mikovits is this world-class, top renowned doctor simply because she says she is, or Mickey says she is in the beginning, without going back and doing any research on how she got to where she is. You have her in the video saying, I am not anti-vaccination, when there is video of her wearing anti-vaccination shirts and hats and speaking at anti-vax conferences that were very quickly sourced shortly after my article went up. And I think part of the reason that my article did well was because I just addressed it very quickly, because I know Mickey, I know this environment, I know the culture, and I saw the holes immediately. And I did not do nearly the level of research that somebody like Science Magazine or Science Journal, which is, retracted Mikovits's claim. They did probably the best overall, refuting all of her points in that and linking to everything. The problem is we're in an environment where this confirms a lot of people's pre-existing biases. They see it. They immediately incorporate it as part of the story and their truth. And so by the time the Science Journal comes out 4 days later, it doesn't matter. And that's what we're seeing. And I didn't think a pandemic could get polarizing, but this is more polarizing than anything I've experienced in my life right now.
Well, I think everybody's scared and confused and there's so much uncertainty because it's a new thing that they're just learning about. Science is still developing, But I did think it was very interesting. One of the things that really sort of piqued at my ears when I read your article was that there's sort of like this connection to The Secret.
Yes.
I was like, oh, okay. So that's because I was very dubious of The Secret in a similar way. Like, I believe in some idea of law of attraction, but not at all the way The Secret was presenting it. Like there's a concept of law of attraction that I think is interesting, and that I'm not going to bet my life on that, or I'm not going to, I'm not going to assume that if I just think this, I'm going to manifest $1 million or whatever. But I do believe in subtle nuances of life that science can't necessarily explain.
Well, I also want to address something that I think is very relevant to this conversation overall. What's happening is that people, the kind of catchphrases I keep seeing is my truth. And that actually is, in a weird way, accurate, but that doesn't reflect reality in any meaningful way. The word intuition, we use that. Like, I intuited, I see this all the time. My intuition was there was something right, and this proves it, right? Intuition, I've written a few articles about that because there's been clinical research on what intuition is. And we'd have to go way back into memory systems, but relating to what you said, your attention goes where you focus, right? So if you think about even cognition, right now, there are things going on all around me, right? Outside of my window here, I'm overlooking Culver City and Sony Studios, and there are people out on the street right now. My wife is in the other room. The cats are milling about. There's all these things going on. But right now, it's me and you talking, and that's where my attention is. And that's always happening. We have to have a advanced filtering system, which is our consciousness, which is always trying to detect threats in the environment, but mostly just staying focused on one thing. So intuition is really just your collection of experiences that have created a framework that you view reality through. And so when something confirms that framework or seems to confirm it, that's intuition. But if you think about all of the times that you've thought about something that hasn't actually been the case, then under that definition, your intuition was wrong. But we don't look at it that way. It's just when we get that dopamine rush of confirmation that it's like, I intuited that. And so intuition is a very real thing. But the problem is it's personal, and it's how you view the world. So people who you nailed it before when you said that there are conspiracies. For example, Trump just appointed a new vaccine chief with ties to the pharmaceutical industry. That is a conspiracy. That is the definition of it. That is a problem. There are many problems with pharmaceutical industry's ties to healthcare industry, but that does not mean that vaccines do not work. And people can't seem to tease those apart.
Well, when I saw the video, I didn't assume that whatever her name, Miskovitz, was like the expert she said she was. But I did think, I wouldn't be surprised if Fauci owns some patents on some vaccines or whatever. And, I did check that out, and it didn't prove to be true. You pointed to it as well. Like, he has his name on a couple of studies that were done around HIV treatments, but not what they were saying about him. You know what I mean? And I just think that, like you were pointing to, because we live in a system where we've profitized healthcare, I don't trust big pharma or even right now, frankly, the DNC even, because I don't really see them pushing for what I'm in favor of Medicare for all. So I don't trust necessarily what I hear from leaders. And that's why I don't think a lot of people do. And that's why I think people are prone to trusting something else than what we're hearing. And, I hear what you're saying about intuition. I do think that in my own, there are things that I rely upon my intuition for and things I don't rely upon my intuition for, Sure. Because I do think that often the best thing I have to go on is my own perception of the matter, because it's me. But ultimately, when it comes to whether or not I'm going to bring harm to other people, and I think that's sort of the case that you and someone like Matthew are making with these videos, like you're posting this out and you're actually potentially causing people harm if you're spreading misinformation.
Well, it is. Whether or not we even reach a vaccine in any foreseeable future is still in question. I think what people don't understand is viruses were... After single cell organisms, when we got to multicellular organisms, we're talking like 3.5 billion years ago, viruses were very early on this earth, and they well predate us. And that is what evolution is. I keep seeing people say this doesn't make any sense. Exactly, right? Because if there was precedent, we'd know how to treat it. During the bubonic plague, and there was recurrences of this over the course of decades, people believed in the miasma theory, which was this idea that noxious gases came out of the skies and they infected you through your skin. So your best line of defense against miasma was not washing your body. There are people who never showered or bathed in their entire lives. They just changed their clothing because they thought that linen would protect them. So imagine living during that time, and you have germ theory doesn't exist yet. Vaccines do exist on some level because they're part of traditional Chinese medicine. They go back well over 1,000 years, but it's not in the literature. There isn't controlled studies yet at this time. And so you're just thinking that by staying as dirty as possible, that's the best health prevention. Well, imagine living that and then finding out that your friends who are dirty are dying. Of course, you're going to think there's some metaphysical reason for all of this happening. So we're now in a similar situation just in terms of this virus. People are like, oh, it's less than 1%, et cetera. If you look at all of what's occurring with this virus, it is one of the most insidious viruses that we've ever faced in our lifetime. I mean, something that could be carried by half the people without them ever knowing it. Something that can take down extremely healthy people and poke holes in their lungs or create neurological damage and cause strokes. But then in the person next to you who might even be a little overweight and not that healthy, they're fine. I mean, that's a really problematic virus. And I really don't think a lot of people understand what we're up against. But I do know whenever I see doctors and healthcare professionals and epidemiologists talk about this, they're warning us to be cautious.
That's true. I hear that, but I've heard, and again, it's not just like the quack YouTube doctors, like other doctors just honestly saying this is confusing because it doesn't look like this, it doesn't look like that, questioning ventilators as a treatment, as a smart treatment for a lot of people. I guess I have a question for you, and I don't know if you can answer this. I have 2 children and they were vaccinated. We did modify the schedule some because we didn't like that they were doing so many all at once in one day. And we went to a pediatrician where they were like open to that. And we did them all within the right timeframes, but we modified the schedule because it made us feel better. I don't know why, but I guess, I think the data, and I know you're someone who values data, would show like we eradicated some diseases, polio and whatnot with vaccines, but we don't. And forgive me if this is a dumb question, I'm just going to ask it. We didn't eradicate flu, you know what I mean? And I've never had a flu shot. So I guess I'm kind of wondering, like when we talk about a vaccine for coronavirus, is there a difference between, say, a polio vaccination and a flu shot?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole idea of specificity. You have to find what actually works for the broadest number of people, recognizing that some people are going to be negatively affected. That's just true. There has never been a vaccine that hasn't hurt some people. That's part of it. So let me address the flu vaccine very quickly. There is 4 strains of influenza that we know of. 3 of them, I think there's 6 overall, but I'm talking about what affects humans. So there's 3 that affect humans and then 1 that affects animals, and we're not sure if it infects humans. Now, each strain has dozens of mutations. So the flu vaccine, I believe it's measured in Australia because Australia has the first recurrence, and so it's guesswork. They look at the first occurrence, and doctors, the researchers, take 1 mutation of each of the 3 strains of influenza. They combine them, and that's the vaccine. And it's guesswork, and they know it's guesswork because they don't know how it's going to travel, and they don't know for sure what mutation is going to be the most damaging that year. So some years it'll be 60, 70% effective. Some years it's under 20% effective. But that is the process of how the flu vaccine works. If you think of the flu vaccine as one thing that you take every year, that's just false. That's not what it is. So researchers are very honest about it being guesswork. So when you're talking about a vaccine for a virus we've never actually seen before because it is new to us, that's why this whole idea of it's going to be here in a year is ludicrous. We don't know. Now, there have been some very small studies that look promising, but it's going to take a little bit of time.
Well, but also there's occasions where you can get it from it. Like you can get the flu from a flu shot. And if there's a possibility it's only going to be 20% effective, do I want to risk getting coronavirus? See, that's what I'm saying. Like, I understand why people would be very hesitant and uncomfortable with this idea of vaccinations, given what you just said, given that it's guesswork.
Well, I don't know of any evidence showing that flu vaccines cause the flu. And I don't understand your connection with the flu vaccine and coronavirus because they're different viruses.
Right. But I thought, and maybe I'm not right about this, that coronavirus is closer to, say, a flu virus than, say, like polio. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but I don't know.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes. That, I mean, coronavirus is closer to the common cold, right? Because that's a coronavirus. Like there's 4 different coronaviruses that cause the common cold. I could be wrong on that, but there's 6 or 7 coronaviruses that affect us, and most of them are the common cold strains of that. And what's really frightening about this is, and this is why there's a lot of discussion about people who are elderly, but mostly people who are obese or have pre-existing conditions, especially immunosuppression, is that what seems to be happening is that coronavirus is exploiting these sicknesses. So why people keep talking about this fall being so dangerous is if you have a flu going around at the same time the coronavirus, if you get hit with both of those, it could be just a perfect storm of danger, because you're going to have you're going to have the coronavirus tethered to whatever other sickness that you have. And that seems to be at least one of the mechanisms by which it works and why it's so dangerous.
Now, see, I hear that, like what you're saying. And then I don't know if you listen to someone like Joe Rogan, who's out there looking at data, and looking at data from Italy, I even looked just out of curiosity because there's that Diamond Princess data, that data set just from the cruise ship. And, when you look at that, you're saying, oh, well, the median age of people dying are 80 years old, or like you're making it sound like we all have to stay in or we're going to die. And other people are saying, and I'm not saying Joe Rogan's like an authority, but there are other people who are suggesting that maybe that's an overreaction.
I am definitely not saying that. Because I've never felt that we should stay in. I think so much of the confusion and distraction that has gone on is because we have an administration that has dismantled our healthcare system even more than it already was. Yes. And so it's just, there's so much confusion about that. The fact that so many of the people that I'm either talking to or getting into arguments with online, we should all be united against the real problem, right? Which is this administration. So if we had testing in place earlier, it's already been shown. The study came out a couple days ago. Like over half the deaths that we already have wouldn't have happened if testing had been instituted earlier. We're still at 300,000 tests a day nationally when all researchers are saying we should be doing 5 million tests a day, like if we want to safely open. So that's the real problem. I have no problem with reopening. I have no problem with wearing a mask. I have no problem with going out.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of J. Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.